Now that we're brought up to speed with the what the 7th Cavalry did in the Southern Plains, I'm going to shift your attention a little bit to the Northern Plains and just briefly describe the situation there. See, the same years that the 7th Cavalry and other units are in the South, in the Southern Plains, defeating Chief Black Kettle at the Washita River in 1868 and basically clearing off a lot of the area for white settlement, basically winning the war in the South. The situation in the Northern Plains was totally different. Same thing is going on up north. There are cavalry units and infantry units up north, and they're fighting the Northern Cheyenne and the Sioux, the Teton Lakota Sioux, as well as other tribes, the Arapaho and several other tribes up north. The situation was different though, where in the South, Custer, the cavalry, the army, the government won with a military victory, and eventually the Indian resistance petered out over a couple of years after that, and basically the government had achieved their victory. In the North, it was different. The Indians won. The war up north was called the Red Cloud War. It was named after the Oglala warrior, Red Cloud, who commanded or actually controlled that band of Indians, and there were other Indians involved as well, other Indian tribes as well. Basically the fight centered around an area called the Unceded Territory. The Unceded Territory is an area in southeastern Montana, area where the Yellowstone River runs through it, and the Powder River is. It's called the Powder River Country. I have a map here, which I will be showing you shortly as we get further into the details of the missions later on. But basically the fights were going on there. There was a little trail that went from Wyoming, southern Wyoming, up into northern Wyoming, up into the Unceded Territory in southeastern Montana, and then off to the west. It was called the Bozeman Trail, and a lot of settlers were using that trail, the Bozeman Trail, to move out west. They were being attacked by Indians, so of course the government had cavalry and infantry, army come in, and what they did was they built 3 forts on the Bozeman Trail to try to patrol the area, sort of like what the army did in the South. They built forts in an east to west pattern in Kansas and patrolled along that. Well, here the same thing is going on. We're in the northern Wyoming, or southern Wyoming, and southeastern Montana. We're building forts there. The 3 forts that were built were in the south, Fort Jesse Reno. In northern Wyoming was Fort Phil Kearny, and in southeastern Montana was Fort C.F. Smith. So from those 3 forts, little armies were patrolling back and forth, trying to pacify the Indians like this armies had done in the Southern Plains. The first big battle occurred in 1866, December 21st, 1866 to be exact. And it happened outside Fort Phil Kearny, which is the fort that's in northern Wyoming. The Indians, their tactics when attacking the forts or dealing with the forts was they would never directly attack the fort. It was too big. It had, cannons. The soldiers could stay in the forts and thus be protected by the big guns, and the Indians could never attack the fort and without losing a ton of lives. So they're not going to do that. What they would do is they would snipe at the fort, try to get the soldiers to come out of the fort and chase them away from the fort, and once they were out of range from the big guns, the support of the big guns and reinforcements, the Indians could try to ambush them or turn around and attack them and fight them on, better terms than having to deal with cannons. It never worked. Soldiers never came out of the fort far enough where the Indians could actually attack them and have the advantage. The soldiers always stayed within the guns. So the major battle that occurred in December 21st, 1866, the tactic was the Indians would come out and try to goad the soldiers to come and get the Indians. Well, the commander that day of the soldiers was William Judd Fetterman, and he decided that he was going to take his 80-man force, he had 80 soldiers with him, move out of the fort, but as the Indians ran away, he decided to chase after them. The commander of the fort, Carrington, he dispatched a letter or a note to Fetterman saying, do not go over this ridge. There was a ridge where the fort was. There was a ridge next to it. And he basically said, do not go over the ridge and out of sight of the fort because we will not be able to protect you then. Fetterman received that order, and the orderly turned around and went back to the fort, so he survived. Fetterman disobeyed the order. He continued to follow the Indians, and he went over the ridge. He followed the Indians, the small party Indians, down the ridge and up to another ridge, and at that point the Indians that he was following, they were decoys. They peeled off. And the soldiers found themselves on this next ridge, surrounded by 800, 1,000 warriors. And the warriors simply came up from all different angles and just annihilated the soldiers. Just serious massacre. I mean, the soldiers never had a chance. The infantry, which was the bulk of the force, had the Springfield muzzle-loading rifles, like they used in the Civil War, where you had to actually physically, jam the mini ball into the barrel and remove the ramrod and put a percussion cap on and fire. And they had one shot, and then Indians were right on them. So they shot, and the Indians were on them. They never had a chance to reload. They were dead meat. The cavalry also, they were armed with breech-loading rifles, but there wasn't that many of them. And the forces were spread out along this ridge, and the Indians just were on them too fast. William Judd Fetterman and all his men were killed. Nobody survived. So that was their one major victory. The Indians never could get the soldiers to come out of the fort. They couldn't get them to come out of the fort before the Fetterman Massacre. Now, after the Fetterman Massacre, definitely nobody's coming out of the forts. So the Indians had to change tactics. And the main tactic they used was they would attack the wood-cutting details. Now, the forts are made of wood, and you need to send guys out into the trees so they can cut down the wood, cut down to make logs, and to build the perimeter of the fort, and to build the buildings in the fort. That's very important. So the Indians decided to start attacking these wood-cutting details, because usually they were far off from the fort, in the trees. They were guarded by very few soldiers. Most of these soldiers stayed in the forts. So they realized if they could kill these wood-cutting details, the fort wouldn't get built, or buildings wouldn't get built. And if they don't build the fort, then that's good for the Indians.